Chairman, thank you very much. I want to say, first of all, thank you all for being here. I very much appreciate your time. I am very deeply troubled about some of the allegations that have been made about improper fraudulent servicing and foreclosure processing. And what compounds this is the firsthand reports that my office has received in Montana. I've reached out to many foreclosure counseling agencies in Montana. I've read through some of the cases that my staff has worked on in recent months, and I will tell you it's not a pretty picture. Mismanagement that goes far beyond robo-signing and the chain of title issues. Since the foreclosure crisis began, we have urged constituents in danger of foreclosure to be proactive and to reach their servicer before they were in trouble. The foreclosure process is daunting, to say the least. Maze of paperwork, computer systems, conflict information. It's a big deal. And the misalignment of the servicer incentives with homeowners and investors, I think it is a recipe for disaster. I've got a couple of examples, and then I want to get to a couple of questions. In one example, a constituent of mine from Whitehall, seeking a modification from Bank of America, was told by a servicing associate that while the loan modification was in review, the homeowner should not make any mortgage payments. Let me repeat that. He was told by their servicer, Bank of America, not to make any payments, and that if they did, they wouldn't qualify for modification. Ultimately, as a result of following those directions of their services, they were hit with interest and penalties and lapse in payments, in addition to badly damaged credit. Then there's a case of a gentleman from Helena who's been fighting with BOA for over a year to prove that he should not be in foreclosure despite having the paperwork to prove that his modification was approved. Never missed a payment, never late with his mortgage. After being told in August, this last August, that the bank has confirmed his modification, he received a letter 2 weeks later telling him that he was in foreclosure, along with a foreclosure notice in the paper. Now, I do appreciate Bank of America's work to resolve the issue. Unfortunately, not everybody calls their U.S. Senator when they have a problem. And I'm still trying to understand how this could go on for a year in the case of the gentleman in Helena. To receive erroneous foreclosure notice, and this was received in a time when Ms. Dezor, there was a self-imposed pause in foreclosures in Montana. So I need to know how this can happen. There's far too many stories out there, and it doesn't have anything to do with Ms. Thompson's testimony, although I very, very much appreciate it. This is stuff that I'm getting in my office. We got a state of 950,000 people, and I've got staff members that are spending a ton of time on this issue. And I think it's more than an isolated case. And if it was the folks who weren't paying their bills, I get that. I have empathy for them, and I understand it, and we'll do what we can do to help them. But in this particular case, these folks never missed a payment, and they're getting hammered. Can you tell me how a servicer could ever tell a homeowner not to pay their mortgage?
Thank you for bringing those to my attention. I think our staff has met with your staff to get those details and to follow up. We apologize, that is not part of what we should be telling homeowners. Of course, homeowners who are current, who are facing imminent default, can be considered for the HAMP and other programs if they can demonstrate that their payments are at risk, and we take those into consideration and do those modifications, and we should never be advising anyone to go.
You attribute this to an employee that screwed up?
An employee who somehow, yes, unfortunately, and we will, after conversations with their staff, we've gone back and reinforced that aspect of our communication to our teammates, and it's a critical part of our training.
I think it's absolutely critical. If I take myself and put myself in that position, I mean, in these economic times, it's tough enough, and then you have something like this happen. It's pretty wild to even think it's possible. The gentleman from Helena, how is it possible he would receive a letter indicating that he is in foreclosure before foreclosure processing has restarted in the state of Montana?
And this goes back to what I referenced in my written testimony and my oral testimony about the dual track of if someone is delinquent and they go into the start of a foreclosure process, and then subsequently we engage in a conversation about a modification. The foreclosure sale will not take place, but that customer continues to get notices, and that's a requirement by certain investors that we do that on a parallel path. And that's where we think there is an opportunity if we work together and we're talking to the state attorneys general under Attorney General Miller's leadership to try to amend that process because we understand how confusing it is. But a customer would not go to a foreclosure sale.
Okay. And I have run out of time, and I'm just going to make a real quick statement, and I appreciate everybody being here today. These particular hearings aren't particularly enjoyable for me, and I know they can't be enjoyable for you. The fact is that why we're here is not an isolated instance like the senators before talked about. There's no doubt in my mind this isn't not isolated. Montana is not a state where people come to the U.S. senator just willy-nilly. They end up in trouble and think they've been wronged, and I don't know how many people out there didn't come to me and end up on the street, and they never did anything wrong. And so it's crazy. So I just want to say in closing, I'm going to remain very concerned about the scope of this problem, the impact it could have on our financial system and on the housing market. I know that the Fed is very much focused on it, and I hope it's something that the Financial Stability Oversight Council will take a closer look at. It strikes me that some of the biggest servicers have been a little bit glib about their potential magnitude of these risks, particularly the risks to their own balance sheets. At a minimum, we need to understand these risks before the Fed moves forward with guidance allowing banks to increase dividends because, quite frankly, there ain't going to be any more bailouts. And so it's important that we get this squared away simply from a fairness standpoint. I think both sides of the aisle can agree on that. Mr. Miller, you had a question or a comment?
Just one very quick comment. I agree with you. We hear about it more often than it be just isolated. And one of the things that's difficult, but we hope we can do, is get to the bottom of how often it happens, why it happens, and how it can be stopped. It's a daunting challenge, but one that we want to work with the banks and with the feds to figure out why this happens, how it can be.
I just appreciate that. I think if you go to what Mr. Levin said about what Countrywide CEO said, I think it was the CEO that said that, this can be taken care of pretty quickly by the servicers. I mean, really quickly by the servicers. I mean, to be honest with you, some heads have to roll if they're given that kind of advice. That's just the way it is.